It's an absolute privilege for me to host this webinar today. At Isentia, we take immense pride in our heritage as the foundational pillar of media intelligence and measurement across Australia, New Zealand, and the broader APAC region. Our mission is to power communications and PR leaders to navigate their complex landscapes with absolute confidence, providing the insights necessary to drive strategic decision-making. In my 20 years in the industry, I believe that this has never been more important because what we know to be true from our privileged position, working as the trusted advisors to the best communications and PR professionals on the globe, is absolutely no surprise to you, which is that the information landscape has never been more complex. They say that AI is the greatest shift in how information flows and truths are derived since the printing press. And as you also know, for communications leaders, AI is no longer a future consideration. Regardless of how you're currently using AI, it is already shaping organizations' reputations, it's influencing narratives, and it is changing the way our stakeholders consume information. So today, in our AI stakeholder webinar series, we're moving beyond the what is it phase into the how do we lead through it phase. We're going to go past the theory to talk about the on-the-ground reality. How are teams actually adapting? What are the new expectations? How do we now prove the value of our work? And where do the real opportunities lie? To help us navigate this, I'm joined by two experts who are at the coalface of this revolution. Let me introduce them to you. First, we have Ngaire Crawford. Ngaire Crawford leads insights and research at Isentia, driving innovation and measurement strategy and product development across the Pulsar Group. With nearly 2 decades of experience in communications research, she champions the power of insight to tell richer stories, shape smarter decisions, and prove the value of communications. A passionate advocate for meaningful data and inclusive storytelling, Ngaire believes measurement doesn't just report impact, it creates it. Ngaire also is central to Isentia's innovation roadmap as a key senior stakeholder in its design, execution, and evolution. Kia ora, Ngaire, and thank you for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Catherine Arrow, who is the Executive Director of the PR Knowledge Hub. Catherine is a globally recognized leader in public relations education and practice, was named the Global PR Practitioner of the Year at the 24-25 World PR Awards. As the founder of PR Knowledge Hub, she provides professional development for practitioners worldwide with a decade-long focus on AI's transformative impact on PR, including launching the first global AI in PR capability certification in 2022. A respected keynote speaker and writer, Catherine's career spans both hemispheres, helping professionals navigate complexity, build capability, and lead with purpose. Thank you so much for joining us today, Catherine. So I'm going to ask a range of questions to Ngaire and Catherine over the next almost 60 minutes. We'll have you out of here on the hour mark, but we want you to be involved too. You'll see a Q&A box in the center of your screen below. Please pose your questions there, and time permitting, we'll cover as many as possible. Finally, please note that this session is being recorded and we will share the link in the coming days. So if you need to attend to an urgent matter, we've got you covered. Okay, let's do this. I might pose this first broad question to both of you, Catherine and Ngaire, and I'd like to go to you first, please, Catherine. Most people today will be familiar with the recent research from Gartner, which anticipates that the AI revolution will dramatically increase the importance of the comms and PR function within organizations. Among many of its predictions, it specifically foresees that by 2027, with mass adoption of public LLMs as a replacement for traditional search, we will see a twofold increase in PR and earned media budgets. Catherine, what are your thoughts on this? And what do comms and PR professionals need to do to turn this opportunity into a reality?
I think it's about moving out of the weeds of tactical implementation, and we have to think very clearly about what it is that we do. And what we're doing as practitioners is building and sustaining the relationships that our organisations need to keep their licence to operate. And with that relationship at the centre and our spheres around the PR atom, if you like, of trust, mutuality, commitment, satisfaction, loyalty, and so on, communication, you can't have a good relationship without good communication in all four forms, our behaviours, and also the understanding that we develop through narrative, through knowledge sharing, through empathy. All of that work is affected by the technologies that we're seeing coming through now. But if practitioners focus their efforts on, well, my analogy that I always use is you wouldn't try and put an engine on a horse to make it go faster, because all you'll end up doing is killing the horse. And what's happening at the moment is that people are trying to retrofit new technologies to old models of practice. And that's not confined to the work that we do. That's across all sectors. It's across all business modelling. And what we need to really look at carefully is, what are we trying to achieve with the technology? What outcomes are we looking for? How can we do this ethically? And people are at very different spaces at the moment. So some people are just encountering generative AI. It may be embedded in Copilot in their workspace and so on, but they're not quite sure how to use it. Others have been early adopters and are busy looking to set up their own agents to undertake tasks. And others are bending the technology even further and designing their own AI applications to help them with their work. But for practitioners, we're not just concerned with how can we use this technology to help us do our job better. We have to bring wise counsel to our organisations so that we're helping them to implement AI across the organisation in such a way that it doesn't widen the digital chasm that already exists. So we've seen organisations using AI for decision making, which means that I might not be able to get insurance cover, or I might not be able to get a loan, or I might be denied housing, or there may be some kind of social scoring in play. And well, we're advocating for our organisation and guarding their reputation, building trust with our stakeholders and communities. We have a dual role, not simply in terms of the productivities or efficiencies that we might be able to enact, but also guide our organisations through what it means to their future and their stakeholders. So in terms of how we're using it, many and varied ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about those practical ones. But my starting point for this is, don't get stuck in the weeds of tactical implementation, because if you do, you will be automated. There's no doubt about that. But if you move your thinking to that relationship structure, and not simply human to human public relations, but also human to AI relations, because in terms of orchestration, oversight, accountability, those types of stop points when organizations are implementing agentic AI, for example, have to be guided and led. And I would hope that practitioners would see the actual opportunity here is to help their organizations to move through that, rather than get bogged down in, let's knock out some AI slop.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a great answer to get us started. I'm interested in your thoughts on that as well, Ngaire. Are we really going to double comms and PR budgets in a couple of years? And how do we turn that opportunity into a reality?
I mean, I think I have very similar observations to Kathy. I think one of the things with the Gartner study that I think is challenging about how it's been, I guess, soundbited, um, reframed it into this budget story, which I do think obscures a little bit that slightly more important shift. And understanding that shift, I do think we need to be, rounded in how we're talking about AI and defining it. So there is, some of the stuff that was spoken about before, where we do have AI as this production assistant, if that's, using Copilot to draft a press release, or generating content variants, or summarizing something, all of the values that sort of come with efficiency. then there's this layer of how you use AI as like an intelligence capability. So if that's using it to make sense of information at a scale that humans couldn't necessarily, moving that into that shift of how narratives are forming, how things travel through different audiences, where there's all of those signals. And then one of the elements that I think gets missed a little bit and is more what this Gartner study is speaking to is using AI in this position of sort of genuine strategic foresight. So using it in this ability to model audience behavior and anticipate where there might be a reputational risk is hitting before it's surfacing. I quite like the phrasing of, counseling ahead of the curve rather than necessarily behind it or in the middle of the curve. And I do feel a little bit, and I'm sure we'll explore it a little bit more in this conversation, that a lot of the communicators that I speak with are still in that first layer of a production tool. And this kind of Gartner study, as grandiose as some of the language is, that's pointing at the results of those other two layers more so than the first. So that opportunity that it describes is really real, but as Kathy was saying, capturing it isn't about, doubling the budget on doing the same thing that you've already been doing. It's not going to be this sort of organic thing that happens. It's about understanding what's actually changed about how your audiences are forming their views, adjusting that strategy accordingly. Like, we know that there are big changes in audience behavior, even just with the introduction of LLMs, how a journalist sources a story, how someone might understand an industry's position on an idea, how a graduate might actually, query whether or not they want to work somewhere and who they want to follow and be influenced by. And these things are already occurring every day. And that's a really fundamentally different information architecture than from where everybody's been quite hyper-focused on social media for, the last decade or so. So there is a shift there. And I think the Gartner headline is sort of a really beautiful way to come into the conversation and start these discussions. But I do think it has to be framed very much as this potential, and you do sort of have to meet that potential rather than it being this purely organic shift.
Thank you, Noah. Back to you, Catherine. I think going to season this opportunity needs to start, as you mentioned a little bit in your answer, with the comms teams, because we always need to walk the walk while we talk the talk when we're giving that counsel that you mentioned to the organisation or the senior leadership. You work with a lot of different PR and comms professionals. How do you go about convincing a potentially cynical or even fearful at times comms team that AI can be a true partner rather than a replacement? What are those first steps?
I think that the first step is I've never yet to meet a fearful comms team. One of our greatest capabilities is courage, because we are set up to advocate inside and outside the organisation. So much of our job is challenging some of the things that are occurring. So the starting point for comms teams that I've found to be most helpful is looking to see what the organisation is doing with AI, so at that top organisational structural level, and then looking to see at the day-to-day what the workflow might be, how that might be enhanced, where the fishhooks might exist, where the opportunities lie. And in terms of take-up, the difficulty that I see for a lot of practitioners is that their organisations are actually resistant to the use of AI. And the starting point that I always recommend is, even if you're not using any of the tools or rolling it out, your first stage has to be data audits. So what is your data saying about you? And how is that leaking out into the data sphere that we all exist in at the moment? Because that information needs to be monitored. It needs to be looked at closely to do some of the insight work that Ngaire was referring to previously, but equally to give them some data insights that they can then share with their leadership teams to say, look, this is the way AI is perceiving our organisation in the AI overviews. So what do we have to do? We have to really look at who we are. Are we You mentioned walking, talking the talk and walking the talk. But when we are looking at our organizations, if we have on one side said, well, these are our values, aren't we marvelous? But then we're behaving really badly, those behaviors are going to be reflected in the digital chatter that exists and is then scraped by some of the RAG models and AI overviews. So that starting point is one that's really helpful, but I'm seeing a wide range of implementation. So discovery, how can it help me do this task? That's a good place to start is, well, what's the thing that you like doing the least? What's the thing that really makes you groan and think, I just don't want to do that today? If it's repetitive, then there's going to be something there that can help you. But then at the other end, that use for crisis preparedness, for example, we had back in 23, we had one of our major weather events when Auckland was flooded, and Mike Bush, who was our top cop at the time, I think he's over in Melbourne now, he was asked to produce the report into it, and the phrase that he used was minutes matter when you're responding to an event like that or any crisis. And AI really does give you those minutes that matter in advance because you can get the insights, you can do your reputation monitoring, you can set up live feeds to come through to you, you can adjust your behaviors and your approach depending on the information that's coming back. So you're in a position to develop scenarios, to train, to prepare in a way that we couldn't do previously. We can use it for stakeholder interdependency mapping, for example, so that we can see not just how one group might be affected in a particular situation, but how those interconnected relationships would work. That type of work used to take forever prior to some of the tools that we have available to us now, but it allows us to do it constantly so that we always have that indicator in our midst. And it's showing the potential for the tools and their capabilities, how they can help us to support our organisations and our stakeholders. That really is the starting point for comms teams. If they are nervous about it, if they are concerned, and rightly so, about the impact it might have on themselves and their colleagues. And when we talk about internal communication and the use of AI tools there, that transparency about AI use has to be absolute across the organisation so that people don't feel that they're being surveyed or exploited or used by the technology rather than it being there as a support. So I don't know if that answers the question. Sorry, I've just...
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah, and I want to pick up where Catherine was talking there, Ngaire, about that concept of giving leaders visibility and the potential impact. And I guess that other end of the spectrum from the Gartner research, we all work for organizations where leaders have a responsibility to achieve financial and operational results. And we can already see that many are using AI to drive efficiencies. And that might be perfectly understandable and work very well in some parts of the business. But potentially there is a fear of many on this webinar today that if this is applied to the communications function, that it will dilute the often misunderstood function at a time when authenticity and trust and reputation, as we'd all agree, have never been so important. So how do we prove to leaders the risk in cutting comms budgets and teams?
Yeah, I think I probably want to reframe it slightly in that I think the idea of proving the risk, I think, already puts us in a slightly defensive position that I don't really think people need to be in. And it's very much the opposite of the opportunity that I think we were all describing a little bit earlier. That is this shift in conversation and shift in behavior into stepping further into that trusted strategic role on AI as well, rather than this idea of trying to defend your seat at the table. And that efficiency argument is very much a trap. If you're walking into a leadership conversation arguing that communications can't be made more efficient, you've probably already lost that argument if it is one. We do know that AI genuinely does automate a lot of production work. I think it's one of the things that comes up constantly in the conversations I have is a little bit of a sense of defensiveness over tasks that we all feel are inherent to us and are very proud of. I'm a researcher. The idea of analysis and writing and all of those things, I've always prided myself on being that's something unique to me. I do that well. Not everybody does that well. Protecting those behaviors is not going to serve you in this sort of new environment. The argument that you can win is about what happens when the judgment layer isn't in the room. So not so much absent from the announcement, but being absent from the decision. And I think there's a really significant difference between those two things. We don't sort of have this really long history to draw from around, the impact of AI when communications expertise isn't necessarily at the table. But I do see this pattern of, communicators might be the afterthought. You're about the execution more so than making those decisions. And it's about trying to improve the organization's reflex to have you in those conversations earlier. And that could be something like where, an organization might be planning to introduce AI to a customer-facing process. The tech team have done all their work on it. It's been reviewed through a legal channel. It's ready to go. And it may be that, a communications person is stepping in to prepare an announcement. And I don't say that in a really reductive way. I'm aware that sometimes this is how it goes. Ideally, where you want to be focusing your reputation with leadership is that you're in that planning conversation, being that representative of your audiences, being that trusted advisor, the one who is focused on how will our customers actually receive this, which audiences might already be anxious about AI and why. What does trust look like in this context, and are we earning it, are we assuming it? And pumping that information to that audience is going to serve you better than necessarily showing how you've built a more efficient release distribution process. It's about sort of changing that frame and behavior. I'm a pretty big advocate for, you kind of behave in the way that you want to be treated. So the more that you can step into that space and lead in that way, I think is really beneficial to changing what those leadership conversations can be.
Thanks, Ngaire. And there's just a reminder to everybody, please hit on that Q&A button and ask some questions. There's been a really great one that kind of extends that theme and probably asks that question in a more eloquent or profound way than I did, from Julie Lee. So thank you, Julie, for being brave enough to ask the first question. And I would throw this to you, Catherine, or if you want to add to it as well, Ngaire. Julie states that comms professionals often have an idea of how AI can help us, but often the C-suite have other less informed ideas. Do you have examples or potentially advice on how you've tactfully pushed back or diverted focus back to where you feel it should be, which is outcomes focused?
Yeah. One of the earlier things that I built was using a customized gem from Gemini to build a reputation monitor. And in customizing that, I used my own research, information on relationship measures, reputation measures. And so it allows me to constantly monitor and pick up on the indicators of an organization's reputation, its social capital, and its social license to operate. So if, for example, organization A says, well, we want to make this announcement, can you just knock it together? I can say, well, look, let's have a look at your reputation here. Let's see what this will do to that reputation, how it's going to diminish your social capital, how it's going to affect your license to operate, what it's going to do in terms of either building or diminishing trust, which in turn is going to affect your social license to operate. So that type of on-the-spot analysis was always harder to do prior to AI, but it does allow you to, if you like, reverse engineer the process. So when you are charged with the tactical, advocate for the why. in terms of why are we doing this? And this is the reason why I would advise you and why you pay me to not do this or to do it in a different way, because you're missing out completely in terms of the connection that you have with your stakeholders, the areas of attention that you need to pay heed to. So that's one example of the way that you can use AI to help you to change the conversation, and also to help you to help others understand the importance of the work that you do and the value that you bring to the organisation.
Thanks, Catherine. Ngaire, do you want to add to that, or I've got another question loaded up for you if you prefer?
I only have a very quick little ad, a very quick little tactical ad. In that space, the only other thing that I often recommend people do, and I do it a lot myself, is when you are struggling to land an idea with leadership that might be about AI or not. Don't sleep on using custom gems or custom GPTs to behave like the people you need to communicate to. It takes a little bit of training, it takes a bit of data feeding, but it can be really helpful to help you understand how to structure information in a way that's going to get your point across to your C-suite or your CEO or whoever it is that you need to. Sometimes people forget that that's a fun little trick to do that I find really effective.
Thank you, Ngaire. On that subject of AI-powered tools, you've been developing Isentia's soon-to-be-released GEO insight/optimization product known as AI View. What are you learning about how LLMs derive their responses and what that means for the reputations of organisations that we all work for, and what communicators should know and do about it?
I like how you use the term GEO, knowing full well how much I hate the term GEO, because I really hate the word optimization in there, because I think it sort of leads communicators towards I think the wrong frame, and there's sort of consequences to not investing your energy in the right place in this environment. And GEO makes this comparison to SEO, which is effective because it's familiar. But SEO worked because that system is pretty stable and it's reverse engineerable. Like, you know what the steps are, you know how to get to the outcome. LLMs aren't like that at all. They're constantly evolving. They're very opaque. And the same query can, produce different responses on different days, and that is by design. They're supposed to do that. But potentially, you've just got to be a little bit cautious around this notion of reliable optimization and things that are changeable. What's actually really a more interesting and possibly more honest way of looking at this is trying to ask what systems may have learned about your organization and whether or not that reflects how you want to be known. So that's a little bit of the question we're trying to explore in building AI View, which will be out shortly. It ultimately tracks how organizations appear in the AI generated responses, and specifically spends a lot of time looking at citations and sources the models are drawing from, and then how those citations are positioned in the responses. We are being quite deliberate about what it is that we're claiming to measure. We can track how an organisation appears in AI responses and the sources that are shaping that picture, but we also know that that is something that only makes sense the more data that you have, and the more times you run those queries to be able to build up a level of consistency in there. What you can't necessarily do is draw the sort of clean causal line from a specific input to a specific output, because the ecosystem is a bit too dynamic for that. Models are going to change. Licensing and copyright restrictions will also change, and what's true to the public now based on model behavior is already different in the models that the AI companies themselves are using. So it's also trying to build an environment that can account for those changes. And I say this with as much affection as I can, and I don't know that other people in the product development team would have the same level of affection, but my role in those rooms is to be really annoying. to ask whether or not what we're building is actually measuring something real, whether the methodology holds up, whether we're creating something that is, genuinely valuable, or is just something that sounds good. So it's not always a typical role for someone like me to be in those rooms, but I think communications particularly has had a lot of metrics that have dressed themselves up really confidently and claim to do a lot of things, but don't necessarily behave in the way that we need them to. And I think what this development process has surfaced is genuinely interesting. We've found that there's these gaps between how an organization thinks that it's perceived and then how an LLM represents them, and it can be a little bit surprising what's influential in the individual models. They weight credibility differently. They weight consistency, they weight how well cited you are by sources that they themselves trust, which can be different model to model. And it means that the response for communications, I don't really see it as like a new technical discipline. It's sort of doing those fundamentals of good communications work, but just in a slightly different intent. Being the organization that influential sources cite, building content that is, reference worthy rather than just sort of existing for your audiences, and knowing which stories and sources might be driving influence in your industry at any point in time, I think is really valuable. But it is that shift of, I think people for a while have been quite focused on specific channel strategy. And that becomes a little bit secondary in this environment to the health of your whole sort of organizational story. The best way to think about it is that if you're being assessed across multiple touch points, how consistent would that story be? And that's probably the biggest structural shift I'm seeing communicators having to consider, is just it's not even a shift, it's sort of a reaffirmation of how important those broader narratives and message structures and reputational tenets are, and making sure that story can be told consistently across a number of channels at once, rather than only a hyper focus on meeting a specific audience where they are.
Nice one, Ngaire. I'm sure you'll agree along there, Catherine, about the potential snake oily nature of some aspects of GEO. But there's a couple of questions, or one comment and a question I might quickly pose to Ngaire before I come back to you, Catherine, that have come through on the Q&A. And thank you again for everyone participating in this conversation. Firstly, Tony Skippington says, Ngaire, if you want to crash test dummy for AI View, Tony is a happy volunteer, so Tony will be coming your way for that. And Alison Hetherington also asks, Ngaire, how much is AI picking up on social media commentary as a part of its description of an organisation?
It's a little bit model dependent. I mean, obviously, if you look at something like Grok, it's very it exists inside of X. What models tend to appreciate, is probably the term I'll use, is forum and things that they believe to be direct to consumer. So review sites often come in quite high. Reddit is high in models that are allowed to use it. There is a lot of sort of dynamics into who is allowed to use what information. I think what we see as the most dominant source when we've been developing this product, and particularly in Asia Pacific, because I've been really wanting to test this notion of how influential is media, because there are a lot of really massive claims about the impact of editorial media in these results, some as high as sort of 80, 85, 88%. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing this greater, I guess, mix between editorial media, but that having a high lean towards trade publications and specialized publications, given the copyright nature of the media markets. We're seeing a fairly even split between that and company content. And then it is things like, a Trustpilot, review sites, forums, Reddit, academic sources. That idea of being reference worthy is where that comes from as well. So I wouldn't say that I'd say those narratives are quite different, but at the same time, something that blows up on X is also really likely to make it to the top of a particular subreddit that may be deemed influential. So it does all kind of flow around, but the history of the whole conversation is far more important to an LLM. It's not really, was whinging the most last week.
Thanks, Don. Hey, Catherine, on another potentially controversial aspect here of comms usage of AI, I think it often gets stuck in the content creation debate about whether AI can write a media release or not, and the potential renewed importance of the humble media release in an LLM world that is powered by verified content. I'm very conscious that this discussion doesn't seem to support the elevation of comms narrative that we're all supporters of. But to put it to bed, where do you stand on this one, and how does the industry graduate it? I mean, when should a brand disclose that a media release or an executive's posts or a social media response was drafted by AI? And probably more to the point, does an audience care about the process or only the message?
Couple of things there. Audience, old school term, because it belongs to the broadcasting age of the 20th century. And we don't have audiences anymore. We have communities of interest and stakeholder groups, and they're desperate to participate. So you've got that layer of you're not sending stuff out. It's stuff that's alive and will be acted upon by people that you may not know. They might be state seekers or they might be stakeholders, doesn't matter. But when you're looking at something that is a piece of information, which is a media release, you also have to look at the function of that in today's environment, given that the LLMs and the agents that are set up are often forbidden from going behind paywalls, from scraping particular sites. So this creates a news vacuum, if you like. So public relations and media relations are not the same thing. Media relations is a tactical part of public relations in terms of communication. But the news environment is such that you have narrative attacks deliberately seeded. So you've got your seeds of untruth that start somewhere like Reddit. Then that rolls up into a higher social media profile that gets picked up by mainstream. Mainstream has got agenda direction by publishers. I mean, we see that filter through from, say, the Telegraph in the UK, which is streamed into the Herald in New Zealand, and the Telegraph has instructed their journalists that they have to have a particular position on various global events and perspectives. So as that gets picked up by mainstream media from social media or from one of the subreddits somewhere, you get a very different narrative. So going back to the point of the layering that Ngaire was talking about, you have to look to see, are these authentic in terms of channel engagement? They may be influential, but it doesn't mean to say that they're authentic. So when you're looking at your organization's touch points, you have to do that data audit, and the importance of partnerships with other organizations, with your competitors, so that you can verify information, so that you can challenge inaccuracies and untruths, becomes a dominant task for our practitioners and our professionals, so that issuing of a media release, unless it's part of a strategic media relations program where you're working with an identifiable and credible group of journalists or a publication that's appropriate and is going to reach into your communities, then you need to really treat it with a pinch of salt and say, is this the right way for us to go? And the danger of narrative attacks is very real. It's very much part of our operating environment at the moment. And it's there that we need to turn our attention more so than just the creation of content, because the likelihood is that content's not actually going to go anywhere. The likelihood is that the AI overview that is produced off the back of all of the work that we do and the others, stories that are being told about us by others, will not result in anybody coming to see us or buy our product, because they're going to be taking their perspective from something that is drawing on training data. And that training data is supplied by humans. So it's full of the same bias and discrimination and curly narratives that a data and a human can produce. So there are areas of work that we really need to turn our minds to now that move us away from that old school approach to media relations, which in today's environment is subject to the whims and fancies of something that's been trained by somebody else. And you can't ignore the pressures that exist on those models that comes from their developers. So you've got a continental drift. You've got all of the models that are developed that come out of the US, and they all have their agendas. Yeah, he who controls the algorithm controls the game, and they will turn it off and turn it on at whim. And on the other side, you've got the models coming out of China, which are cheaper. There's supposedly less in terms of environmental impact and cost and so on. But you've got competing models that are being pushed forward at a pace of knots, not for any great societal benefit, but because there's money to be made. So as somebody who's been working in this space for over a decade, when the first models were being released or not released because they were deemed to be too dangerous, this acceleration in pace and the push for adoption is really because of the profit motives, if you like. And it's not necessarily something that we have to rush into, and if anything, slow it down. So when you're looking at your workflow, see where it's really going to help and see if that's going to be effective. And if you're looking at your organization's reputation and relationships, then look at it again. You know, is anybody going to be harmed? Would we be happy defending this use of AI in the work that we do? But however you use it, declare it. In time, nobody's going to care. We've got influencers that are AI influencers that make hundreds of thousands a day, you know, beyond anything that we could make doing what we do. And their millions of followers really don't mind that they are AI. It's just part of the environment. And in the same way as 20 years ago, when social media was in its slow rise, and people were saying, "Oh, well, you know, I can't use this, can't use that." If you are part of that generation coming in, it's what you've always known. And for those of us who are part of this now, people coming into it, it's what they will have always known. But what you can't do is take the people out of it. And that's the problem that we're seeing at the moment, is that the pressure to implement is meaning that people are getting left by the wayside. And that's really not a very good thing at all.
Thank you, Catherine. Nari, I wanted to explore the idea of polarization via AI with you. And the kind of the scene center on that is that Isentia did some research into the voice referendum in 2023 in Australia that showed that certainly the polarization effect or echo chamber effect of social media perpetuated the "if you don't know, vote no" narrative. The Financial Times recently released analysis using a data set of tens of thousands of responses in LLMs to investigate whether and how the most widely used AI chatbots shape conversations about politics and society. And the results strongly support a theory of AI chatbots as depolarizing and technocratizing, where social media elevates fringe views, AI nudges them towards the center. What are your thoughts on that research and concept, and what does it potentially mean for how audiences will derive their truth in future?
I have many many thoughts on that particular study, and I do want to engage with this carefully because I think this is also one of those things that we are at a real risk that we believe this kind of finding because we want it to be true. And I think after like years of algorithmic outrage and misinformation, which is not over, but the idea that AI gives us this more balanced information environment is really appealing. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily true or that it is as proven as we would like it to be. And I think that idea of it being more centrist gives this political weight to systems that aren't focused that way and believe themselves to be consensus weighted. And so that echo chamber problem doesn't actually disappear with an LLM. It just sort of gets dressed up a little bit differently. Social media created echo chambers through like amplification of what made you angry or what confirmed what you already believed. LLMs have a different but related tendency. So they're designed to be helpful and agreeable and responsive to the person asking, which means that that bias outside of sort of the training data bias does shift from the platform itself and more into the prompt. So if you ask an LLM a leading question, you're likely to get a response that validates your framing, and sometimes it can be difficult to determine whether or not your question is leading or not. And as these systems become more and more personalized, so they learn from your interaction history, they anticipate what you're likely to agree with, that tendency is going to become more pronounced and not less. Like, I know I've certainly had enough conversations with my various AI systems to notice that the longer that you interact with one, the more it shapes its responses around what it knows about you. And that's not balance. That's sort of a more sophisticated form of the same problem. So I think that I guess the question for communicators is really about that, thinking about how your communities are forming their views through AI. And I'd be cautious about assuming it's a more neutral environment. The question to ask is sort of who is doing the asking, how they're likely to be asking it, and what potentially in response to that question they may learn. So that is very much part of that strategic communications conversation about understanding your stakeholders, your community relationship with information, what they trust, what they seek out, how they might ask questions. That's going to be as important as it ever was. So that channel changes a little bit, but that human behavior underneath it doesn't particularly.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
But don't burst my bubble even further, please. But yeah, please go ahead. Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, no.
It's going to burst. The problem with the acceleration of misinformation, and World Economic Forum has flagged that as top 1 risk, top 2 risk for the last few years, is that AI has the ability to create all sorts of things at speed and share it widely and amplify it to such a degree that Tim Marshall, Prince leader here in New Zealand, often used to say that we operate where issues collide. And what's happening with AI is that we're now operating where realities collide. So because of the way that the technology can be used, and I've got a misinformation session on Friday about managing misinformation, and part of the look that I've been involved with this week is how the misinformation is seeded, and the money that is in misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, you can buy it off the shelf. It's disinformation as a service, and there's money to be made. So if YouTube has put in some checks and balances, but they haven't stopped it all. It's very easy for me to set up a faceless AI channel in any particular network, feed that with conflict, and then that conflict is then amplified and it leads to further polarization. And that polarization and loss of social cohesion, particularly as we come up through elections, is a really, really dangerous space at the moment for everybody. And so I find myself not agreeing with that study and with those results, because the actual day-to-day experience of feeds is that you will be presented with things deliberately that will either make you angry or that you'll agree with to prompt engagement. And the more engagement there is, the more money there is to be made. So that's an area where, as practitioners, again, we will have and do have a new responsibility to help with that particular aspect of AI implementation.
Thank you, Catherine. We will we'll share that study as part of the follow up to this, as well with the Gartner study, and maybe we can see whether anybody else shares my potential optimism on that Financial Times study. But thank you very much, Catherine and Ngaire, for educating me on that one. We're running out of time here, and thank you again to everybody who's asking questions. I think we've really got to. I wanted to pose a question, the same question to both Catherine and Ngaire to kind of wrap us up, really, because it has a bit of detail in it, but it's the age-old advice question. So, and Catherine, you touched on this a little bit before, but obviously LLMs are developing their own distinct personality and suitability, and it feels like at the moment everybody's fawning over Claude and the most widely as the most widely available LLM to communicators. I've recently heard ChatGPT described as crap GPT, which is on the nose, but like the reality is that the space is changing so rapidly that sometimes it often feels like it's a full-time job just keeping up with the updates and all of the evolving possibilities. Maybe Catherine, you go first, and then we'll go to Ngaire to round us out. What is your advice to communicators for keeping up with the possibilities and the ever evolution, the rapid evolution of this AI world that we live in?
Play. Just get in there and play. Experiment with the free tools so that you don't have to lose money on it, but be careful what you put in and be careful what you wish for. Look at how to work with an agent. So Manus is one that I've worked with since it was launched at the early part of last year. But Claude has got the co-work capability that you can add. You can create agents using Copilot if that's what's within your organization. You can set up your computer use through Perplexity. Experiment and play, and ask yourself, what is it I want to achieve with AI? I've got an AI compass that I use in different sessions. And the first point on the compass is insights, using it for that. But the next one is integrity, so using it ethically. But a really important one is imagination. Yeah. Use your imagination. There's an old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, an old sci-fi book, which is much loved by many. And in that, there's a robot called Marvin. Marvin's permanently miserable. He's a bit like Eeyore, and he's always being asked to do things that he considers to be well below his capacity. So, oh, you asked me to pick up a piece of paper and I've got the brain the size of a planet. Well, that's pretty much what people are doing with AI. They're treating it like Marvin. So use your imagination and think, how can we do this differently? We know we need to build relationships between people. We know we need to help our organization build their license to operate and develop their social capital. How can we do it in a new way using these tools? So my starting point is always roll your sleeves up, switch it on, have a really good play.
Thank you, Catherine. How about you, Ngaire?
Yeah, I would advocate for the same thing. Also, sometimes a good starting point is to actually, Claude's my personal favorite, but you can open up Claude, open up GPT, Gemini, whatever you've got, and ask it that question of like, I don't know where to start, and just start riffing with it from there. And I think lay it onto that. It's also about building out your trusted sources on AI. And I think that is something that people can feel really intimidated about. But I don't necessarily suggest trawling LinkedIn for content. LinkedIn's a funny space at the moment. But I think it is finding those voices that you trust, finding the podcasts that you can put on while you're doing other things, finding those voices that resonate with you. And I think you find like an ethical kinship or a philosophical kinship with, and just listen and learn. They often have really interesting resources. There might be something you can play with there. I know that it can feel a little bit intimidating to just kind of jump in and have a go, but I think it is a combination of that and also, grounding yourself in sources that you trust and that you love, and taking their advice and taking their lead and building out your own little council, really.
Excellent. And you know what? I think I've gone the early crow on one more question each. You've sped through that for me. So if we can go with the same intensity on this one. There's probably one final question for both of you, which is, and maybe we stay with you, Ngaire, and then we'll finish up with Catherine. Which is, what is a notable success or failure that you've either actually just make it success? I always like ending on a positive note. What's a notable success that you've seen or personally experienced regarding the use of AI in a communications context?
It's probably not a technical one as much as a behavioural one, and I think you sort of tackle this in both ways. Something that I've definitely been observing, and is one of the more encouraging patterns that I've seen, is that there is this correlation between communications teams that are generally, genuinely thriving, and those that have stepped into that company-wide leadership role around AI adoption and understanding. So not only being part of using AI themselves, but really actively leading the conversation internally, whether that's, running AI education sessions for the broader organization, being the team that pilots new tools and shares what they've learned, like owning the narrative around how an organization talks about AI internally as well as externally. It's the communications teams that are doing that work are building that reputation and trust element really in a really valuable way. They're developing that level of credibility and authority inside their organisation that we were referencing earlier. So going beyond that, what might be their traditional remit and sort of running headfirst at something that's more of could feel more like internal comms or enablement or something like that, but really positioning themselves as the leaders in that space within their organisation, and that sort of building that level of to put them in those conversations and that decision-making process a little bit earlier.
Amazing, Ngaire. Thank you. Bring us home, Catherine, with less than 2 minutes. What's your advice?
I think that I would echo everything that Ngaire said, and also add to that the times that I can think of standing there and cheering when I've seen some outcomes with practitioners that I've been working with, is taking it one step further than that and helping the organisation to realise that their rapid rollout of AI is something that they need to pause, because the teams have helped the organisation to understand the long-term consequences and impact on the organisational outcomes and strategy. That change of direction and the wisdom, the wise counsel, if you like, has meant that people haven't been disadvantaged by AI, and that there's been a suitable pause, but then an effective implementation where it can be of benefit to organisation and communities.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much to everyone for sharing your valuable time with us today. I hope you've learned as much as I have from Ngaire and Catherine, and I have no doubt that you will join me in extending our appreciation to them. So thank you both so much, Ngaire and Catherine. As I said, we've had some great questions that have come through today, and we inevitably haven't been able to get through all of them. So we'll follow up with the blog post answering all of the remaining questions. Stay tuned for that. As you can see on the screen, there are also some links to Catherine's PR Knowledge Hub, where you can tap into further into her expertise and even organise bespoke training. You can also access the latest from Isentia, including some of the current and future products that we mentioned today, to strategically empower APAC's leading communicators. Finally, I wanted to indulge in a personal goodbye. After 20 years, my journey at Isentia is coming to an end this week. It has honestly been the privilege of my career to be involved in conversations like this that help people to be more successful, and I'm really going to miss them, and I'm going to miss you. I'm off to an important media partner of Isentia's named Private Media to hopefully put to good use all of the things that I've learned over many years. And the Isentia rocket ship, led by amazing people like Ngaire, is going to keep delivering for you as your trusted advisor in media intelligence. So I look forward to watching you all soar. Thanks and goodbye.